I don't know why.
Hello, welcome to Democracy Rising's podcast. We're here today to talk to Alan Richrod, who is a political activist, historian, and former elected official. And we're going to talk about history of um, political terms and current political terms. And please welcome Alan Richrod.
Hello.
Can you tell us a little bit about yourself, Alan?
Well, my interest in politics started with the 1960 election between John Kennedy and Richard Nixon, and I remember the controversy, although I didn't know of it at the time. I was like in first grade. There was a big controversy over John Kennedy because he was Catholic, and he had to go on national television and tell the country that, yeah, he's Catholic, but it's okay. Just like Obama had to go and tell the country that he was black, but it's okay. And so history was repeating itself. But that I've been interested in history and where things came from and started ever since.
And so you've done quite a bit of research on a lot of political terms and political movements. Is that correct?
Well, and that was when I got my history degree. That was a lot of what we studied, was the origins of policies and politics and social conventions and all of that kind of stuff. Some more so than anthropology or any of that kind of stuff. Okay. And it was interesting to find out how often history repeats itself, and it's that's kind of the genesis of it.
Okay, so let's kind of start out with what historically these terms that we identified have meant, and then we'll move into a little bit more recent. So,
sure.
What is a progressive?
Well, the progressive movement started in about the 1880s, 1890s, and resulted in the important thing that happened was the election of Theodore Roosevelt as a corporate Republican, and him realizing that was not going to help the country at all. Then that's where the progressive idea came from at that level, and it also spurred the union movement. And there was a lot of progressive writing a lot of it out of Europe, and it's similar to what we think of today. But today, a progressive really is kind of anybody that, if you can follow the Bernie Sanders set of issues, and that's the progressive playbook, or at least the items that we're dealing with. Healthcare is a right, education is a right, and development of unions, and this ridiculous idea of endless wars and rebuilding infrastructure and not giving tax breaks to the rich, because trickle down, which is another old term, doesn't work, and you spur economic growth in times of economic hardship by the government expending money to put people to work. And the idea of the government being the employer of last resort. If there are no jobs anywhere, you can go and you can work on road crews, you can build bridges, you can do whatever you need to do, and the government would pay you for that. And we're also experimenting with, in some places, with universal or with basic income.
Oh, right.
And I think it's in Michigan right now. They're experimenting with a $500 basic income where there's a floor through which you won't fall, so that you don't end up with nothing. Right. That's a very progressive idea.
It is.
It's been around for a long time, but we're now actually trying it. But in the progressive, it really today is in contrast to corporate Democrats, or middle of the road Democrats, centrist Democrats, who really are essentially Republicans. And in what they do, whatever they call themselves. You can kind of judge by what you do rather than what you say you do.
Right.
And but
So tell us
Bernie Sanders tapped into that.
So how about you mentioned Democrats? So what would you consider to be like an old school Democrat?
Well, and it's a good way to phrase it, because that's not what Democrats are today necessarily. Now, a Democrat is someone who belongs to the Democratic Party, and but the old school, when I say old school Democrat, I'm talking about something that came out of the FDR New Deal era, and in that case, it was the government building industries in the Civilian Conservation Corps and the National Recovery Act, and I can't remember the other. There was a whole alphabet soup of government programs that put people to work and paid them for that. And Social Security came out of that, which was, again, it was the idea that when you retire after a lifetime of working, you don't retire into poverty. You retire into at least a small guaranteed income that allows you to keep going and buy food and rent and things like, to survive, right?
So I just thought of this. I guess Social Security could be considered a universal basic income, couldn't it?
It's the idea. That's the same idea, and it starts at 65, and in France, for example, it starts at 60. And these are programs that, of course, Republicans have been trying to take away since the 1930s, and it's part of the responsibility that everyone has that lives in a democracy, in a republic, to pay a little bit into the system so that the system can support everyone. And that kind of removes it from, unfortunately, from they don't work because they're lazy. Well, that's not, there's more to it than that.
Right.
And universal basic income is one way to deal with that. But you're right. It's Social Security is a universal basic income for retired people. And it really should be, as Bernie Sanders has pointed out, it should be expanded and increased so that people can live better, because with retired people and working class people below the so-called 1%, when you give people like that money, they spend it, and that spending of money is the engine of the economy. You give rich people money and you never see it again.
It's true.
No.
Yeah, they can only buy so many pairs of pants. That's analogies I've heard. Yeah.
And the way I'd always phrased it is, it's based on the price of a gallon of milk. I go into Safeway and I buy a gallon of milk, and Bill Gates is standing behind me in line. He pays the same amount that I do. Mm-hmm. But the story of the widow's mite, if it could be that $5 I pay for a gallon, I don't know how much a gallon of milk is, but that could be all I have left in my pocket. And,
so as a percentage of your income, you're paying more than someone like Bill Gates. Yeah.
That's right. And, buying a new car, I mean, that's the outside of your house, that's probably the most expensive thing you'll ever buy. Well, the Bill Gates and the Koch brothers and that kind of people, I mean, they can spend $50,000, $60,000. They'll find that in a couch,
Yeah, true. So what's the relationship between a progressive and a Democrat?
Well, now it's been separated. Unfortunately, early on, Democrats were progressive, and we talked about this before, but there was an era in the 60s where there were progressive Republicans. There were Republicans who believed in keeping the government out of everything, but setting things up so that they would run by themselves. You had Republicans who were in support of unions. You had Republican administrations who were in support of, that's where the Environmental Protection Agency came from, was from the Nixon administration. And
conservation, yeah.
Yeah. And in that case, that particular case, he thought it was a compromise that, well, okay, I'll give you the EPA if you'll shut up about something else, and but progressive governors around the country. There were more than a dozen of them, and a lot of them in the Northwest and the Northeast, where you had parkland set aside, and Earth Day. They responded to the public pressure for Earth Day in 1970, I think it was the first one. All I remember is getting out of school, but that was cool. We got out of high school and got to go and pick up trash.
Nice. So what we talked about, an old school Democrat. What's an old school Republican?
Well,
you touched on a little bit there, but
yeah, by and large, to give you the kind of the bumper sticker statement of it, the old school Republicanism was the government in charge of a few things like defense and pretty much not much else, but leaving business regulations and social regulations and that kind of stuff, leave that out of it. And the idea of free markets, which we can argue that there's never been such a thing as free markets, and there aren't today, but to let the market decide, for example, how industries are run. And that's very dangerous. But the Democrats, old school Democrats, would theoretically keep an eye on all of that. And you would see the banking industry and the stock market industry getting together and causing the Depression of 1929. Now you put in regulations so that banks can't do that anymore. That's where we got the original separation of investment banks and savings banks, where banking should be boring. I mean, you go in and you put your money in and they keep track of it and that's it. And then investment banks were like Goldman Sachs and places like that, where you can go and you can invest millions of dollars in companies and all this kind of stuff. And those two were historically separate. Now they're not.
Right.
Ronald Reagan started that. Bill Clinton helped him, and we haven't tried to fix that. Dodd-Frank tried to fix that a little bit, but that's always been a Democratic idea that essentially a capitalist economy doesn't work without regulations, just like you can't have a football game without referees. If there were no rules, then what's the point?
Right. Just be a bunch of guys beating up on each other.
Yeah, and we can go anywhere and see that.
Today's the Super Bowl, so yeah.
Yeah, that's true.
Okay, so out of the Republican ideals came the Tea Party. What's up with the Tea Party?
Well, that the Tea Party is that was, in looking back at the history of it, has nothing to do with the Boston Tea Party. That was originally referred to as the incident in Boston Harbor, and then there was a book published. I don't remember the author. I could probably find it, but there was a book published about 50 years afterwards, because all of the participants in the Boston Tea Party, the throwing the tea over the ship, took an oath to not tell anyone about it or anything about it, who they were and any of that, for 50 years. And one guy survived, and he wrote a book about what happened. He called it the Boston Tea Party, and that's where that came from. And it was theoretically about the fact that colonists were taxed without being represented in government, and that wasn't the story at all. It was actually the British East India Company being given charter by the king to cut prices on tea almost in half and put all other tea producers out of business, because the American
okay, but sorry, Alan, I'm going to round you about to right now the party that they're, the Freedom Caucus and all that's going on right now. What is that all about?
Oh, okay. Well, the Freedom Caucus is a little different, but
you know what I'm talking about. I know what you mean.
Yeah, the modern Tea Party, that was that whole myth was ingrained in public education for the last 150 years, and that was the convenient moniker that was slapped onto this idea that was that was formulated by a Koch brothers group Well, through Americans for Prosperity, which is one of their organizations, and Citizens for a Sound Economy, which is another one of their organizations. And their founders, they're some of the founders of the Heritage Foundation, and their vice president of political action, essentially, which I think Rich Fink, it's a wonderful name for somebody like that. And he was the one that developed the strategy that ended up becoming the Tea Party movement. And they were able to sell it to people through ownership of and use of media at the time, because Reagan had taken away all the rules and regulations about owning media, and Bill Clinton helped him with that, so that they could spread the word, and people would. It resonates with people. I mean, you pay in taxes, you shouldn't be paying any taxes, right? Rather than, well, you pay taxes so that everyone else can, so that literally the tide raises all boats. But I'm getting some noise there. But the modern Tea Party really is not a grassroots movement. They called it an astroturf movement. But fortunately, they published a playbook on how they did their this was coming out of the election of 2008. A playbook on how to take over local parties, how to organize elections, and you could even swing elections, and the Democrats could learn from this. Republicans, that's the you probably heard this, the adage that Republicans fall in line and Democrats fall in love. And we're seeing that now.
Well, I think the grassroots movement Indivisible, their Indivisible guide is based off the Tea Party's guide on how to go to contact your members of Congress and go to town halls and get the attention of your elected officials. And that's, I mean, if it worked for the Tea Party, it could work for Indivisible, I suppose, right?
That's exactly right. And the guys that wrote that pamphlet were congressional aides, and they'd seen it work. And I saw on an interview, I think it was on MSNBC, with one of them who said that's exactly what they were doing. Is they took the Tea Party, I can't remember the name of the pamphlet that they published, which I have on another machine, and they just substituted out their own ideas for what they were doing. And if it works for them, it worked for us.
Right.
And but it tapped into a populist movement, and it depended on, and this is the easy part, it depends on convincing people of certain facts and hoping that they don't dig too deep.
Right.
Because once you do, you find out, well, wait a minute, maybe this isn't the case. But it's really easy to run a campaign on bumper stickers.
Right. So let's move into neoliberal and neoconservative. Those are terms that we've been hearing, at least in my lifetime. So what is a neoliberal?
Well, and both they're similar. Neo, of course, comes from the Greek for new, and neoliberalism is a system of essentially a system of economic thought that comes out of the old French term laissez-faire, meaning leave everything alone. Don't let government get involved in anything. Let the marketplace determine prices. Let the market determine the size of companies. And monopolies, well, they're a monopoly because they were skilled and better qualified to be monopolies and that sort of thing. Just keep government completely out of it. And it's a kind of morphed into, I think it might be connected to the term liberal, which it's not particularly, other than sharing the word. But neoconservative takes it one step further, saying that we shouldn't necessarily let business take care of business and all of that kind of stuff. The economic side of it, but we should also control the social side of it. So we can determine what's best for you medically, and we can, healthcare. Well, we'll leave that to the insurance companies because they're more qualified to run that than.
Free market.
It's not a right; it's something that you have to buy, right?
Right. Is that like free market capitalism, right?
Yeah, and if we don't have free markets, we never have.
Right.
Strictly speaking, free markets.
Right. So, what do you at the current time where we are right now? Is there any difference between neoliberal and neoconservative? Really?
Yeah, there's a difference, but it's kind of confined to a dictionary definition, to the quote unquote man in the street. To the average person, it doesn't matter if somebody's taking stuff away from you. It doesn't really matter what they call themselves. They're denying us healthcare coverage, and they've given a $1.5 trillion tax break to the rich. Well, whoever's doing that, I don't care. The fact that they're doing it is the important thing. And so, and well, it goes on and on. Gun rights and voting rights. I mean, is that a neoliberal thing? The removal of the right to vote, even though it's constitutionally guaranteed. Is that a conservative or a liberal thing? I don't care. The fact that it's happening, the Republicans are doing it, but
I don't care.
It doesn't. I don't care about that. It's wrong and has to be stopped.
Right. All right. So let's talk about some past administrations, real quick. Talk about FDR and Eisenhower. How did that, group of administrations come out? I mean, what was that all about?
Well, FDR, of course, came out of the previous Republican administration of Hoover, and the crash that happened in 1929 is really the same sort of a thing that caused the crash in 2008. It's the same idea. The banks got
repeat.
Yeah, a little bit different reasons, but Franklin Roosevelt saw himself as a champion, even though everybody points out they were a rich family, dynastic family, but he saw himself as a champion of the working people, and in the realization that when everybody in the country is working, then the country's moving along. And if the super rich have all the scratch, then nothing happens. They just sit on it, and there was no Social Security. There were unions were building in power, but they weren't that powerful yet. And then employment was stimulated by the government. People talk about the World War II is what brought us out of the Depression. Well, no, the Roosevelt policies brought us out of the Depression. In about 1938, the Republicans won a victory in that the administration dialed that back, and the country started to sink again. And then came World War II. And Eisenhower was a progressive Republican, and I think it would be a good way to put it. But he was very much anti-war, anti-military, having been he was driving the entire bus, and the Supreme Allied Commander of forces in Europe.
Right.
So he knew what an unbridled military could do. He had one at his back, and he was fighting one.
Right.
So that was the whole point of his speech at the end of his term, his second term, his address, where he talked about the military-industrial complex. That's where that phrase came from.
Right.
But Eisenhower built the interstate system, and that just happened to mesh together, because originally it was a Defense Department idea. In 1949, it was the military wanted a way to move equipment, and we were now using missiles and that kind of stuff that are big, and they have to be transported. So an efficient way to do that would be a superhighway system throughout the country.
Right.
And he saw that, but he also saw the tremendous commercial advantage of having that available.
Right. Right.
For transporting goods by truck and all that kind of stuff. So,
okay. So
but that
kind of two progressive presidents in a row, right there.
Well, and Harry Truman in the middle. That was all for the good of the country rather than the company. It was, but they understood that.
Right.
Republicans understood that you had to support what was good for the country. That has kind of gone away. It's now become party centric.
Yes.
And so that people say, well, the Democrats and Republicans are the same thing. Well, they're not, but they're close enough, and that's kind of the inevitable end of it.
Well, I mean, like you said earlier, it's kind of like the doesn't matter who's taking your livelihood and your health and everything away from you. If they're both doing it, then they're the same thing. So, what about Jimmy Carter? Would you call him an old school Democrat?
An old school Southern Democrat. In the back in the day, the Southern Democrats were a little more conservative, tended to be more religious oriented and all that. Although completely invested in the idea of separation of church and state, which isn't the case anymore, obviously. But Jimmy Carter was kind of the last bastion of the old school Democratic idea that supporting social programs is good for the entire country.
Right. And he was the only president within whom's term there was no war.
It was only 4 years, unfortunately, but that's sad but true.
Yeah. Okay, so how does he compare to Bill Clinton?
Well, Bill Clinton was he's one of the reasons that I say that there's 3 Democrats in the Congress, and he was never one of them. And that whole line of thinking came out of the idea that Reagan ran away with the election in 1980, and it scared the Democrats so bad that they thought they had to be more like Republicans, and that maybe that's where the whole neoliberal thing came from. I think it's been misused a bit, but Bill Clinton, he was a Democrat, and he threw more crumbs to the social programs than the Republicans did, but Bill Clinton was the one who gave us the Telecommunications Act of 1996 that broke down the barrier between the artificial fence that said that you couldn't own all of the media in a particular area. You could only own 30%. And he knew that Reagan had cut taxes too much, clear down to 25% at one point, top tax rate, from more than 70%, and he could have brought some of that back, but he didn't. He caved into the Republican demands, and Republicans are real good with power, maybe not necessarily leadership, but with power, and Democrats are great at coming up with great ideas for programs and things to do, but not very good on the organization part of it.
Okay, so you mentioned Reagan. So what was the Reagan Bush era? That you said they lowered the corporate tax rate. What was that? Was that in response to something, or?
Well, it was the maximum. I can't remember the term, but it was essentially the maximum tax rate, which John Kennedy had lowered in '61 from 91% to 75%, and then it got down to 70% under Jimmy Carter, and then Ronald Reagan dropped it to 25% in 1981, and it was called I believe it was called the Income Fairness Act or something like that, and that unfortunately pulled the rug out from underneath the government, and that was kind of coined. The phrase he coined was "government is the problem." Well, no, government is not the problem. It may not be the solution, but government is not the problem. But that's easy to sell. You're being taxed. It's your money to begin with. Well, yeah, that's true, but there's a lot more to it, and I'm from the what was the nine most feared words? I'm from the government. I'm here to help. That resonates real well, and that's an easy thing to hang your policies on. And once you get the public behind you with your idea, you can do whatever you want to underneath the rug. That and
Right.
seeing that today.
Right.
And but ironically, Reagan raised taxes 4 times after that, realizing that they had cut taxes too much.
Right. He was creating more of a deficit than he didn't. Apparently, they didn't think of it that way. That they were going to be creating the deficit. Growing the deficit.
Well, I maintain, maybe he didn't. I maintain that there were people in power that did,
Mm-hmm.
and we had it was what's called the two Santa Claus theory, and the idea is that they cut the taxes so far that the government can't provide the social programs that it's meant to provide. And so what you do, if you're a Republican, you borrow a bunch of money to keep those going. And then when the next administration comes in, if they're Democrats, great, because then the whole thing will collapse on them and they'll be blamed for it, even though you did it.
Right.
I come along and set your house on fire, but it's your neighbor that actually did it. And
so
it's a brilliant strategy, but it's dangerous for the country.
Right. Right.
And that's what we're doing right now.
So, what about a comparison, or who would you more likely compare President Obama to, Carter or Clinton? The last two.
Obama was Clinton version 2.1, I think. He was better on some of the social programs, and he canceled the Dakota Access Pipeline, not the Dakota Access. It was the other one.
Keystone XL, yeah.
Yeah, the Keystone XL. And he was great at supporting the social programs that politically didn't cost him anything. But, he deported more people than any president in history. And he didn't do anything to really dial back the wars that Bush got us into, through lie. And
Right.
He closed Guantanamo prison. Well, he didn't really. He just signed a paper, said, go close it. Well, yeah.
It didn't happen, yeah.
He could have fought so much more for, we could have had universal health care. The people that
Right.
went to the Senate hearings and wore the T-shirts got ushered out by the Capitol security.
Yeah. Well, the Democrats had a supermajority in the House and Senate, and
for the first 2 years they sure did.
Yep, and they had a Democratic president. We were in the position that the Republicans are. Well, actually, we were in a better position than Republicans are in now, and we could have had a heck of a lot of things like universal health care, at least a public option.
Indeed.
And they just didn't want to do it. They didn't do it.
And I blame them for not doing it. And
Right.
You can understand it when you I think it's followthemoney.org or something like that.
Open Secrets, maybe?
Crooks and Liars is another one. That's a blog site. But when you do that, you follow the money and you find out that pharmaceutical companies and health insurance companies, and to pick on this one issue, and some of these hospital companies and stuff, that healthcare corporations put literally billions of dollars into politicians as an investment, and they know they're going to get 10 times that back.
That's right.
And plus, you're giving money to people who, if you give us money, we'll do what you want. And that somebody like Bernie Sanders is a real danger to that. So that's why there's such resistance to somebody like that.
Right. So I'm going to leave it there, and we'll have the rest of this discussion maybe at another time.
We've got so many other things we can talk about over
I know.
Entire half hour.
Exactly.
That's great, though.
We'll have plenty of times to do this if we feel like it. And so I want to thank everybody for watching. Thank you, Alan, for being here. And we'll be back again with other topics and other things to learn and to grow with. Thank you so much. And
Power to the people.
Later. Power to the people. Thank you, Alan.
Okay, you bet.